It was a quiet evening, just after sunset, when Officer Parker, a veteran of the city's police department, pulled over the car. He had been working the night shift for years, and this was nothing out of the ordinary. A standard traffic stop. The headlights of the squad car illuminated the vehicle in front of him as he turned on his siren, signaling the driver to pull over to the side of the road. The car, an older model sedan, had a cracked taillight and expired registration tags. It was a minor violation, but one that needed addressing. Officer Parker had made hundreds of stops like this in his time. Nothing too serious, usually just a warning or a ticket. And then he'd be back on his way. He adjusted his cap, took a deep breath, and stepped out of his squad car, his boots making a soft crunch on the gravel. His flashlight flickered in his hand as he approached the driver's side, a little tired but still alert. The night was cool, and the streets were mostly empty. The only sound was the hum of the officer's radio in the background. The driver, a middle-aged man, appeared tense. He had his hands firmly on the steering wheel, his eyes avoiding the officer's gaze. Officer Parker could see the nervousness in his posture, the slight tremor in his hands. The man didn't make any sudden movements, but it was clear something was off. Officer Parker had learned to read people over the years, and this man's unease was more than just about a simple ticket. "Good evening, sir," Officer Parker greeted as he shone the flashlight into the car, checking for any signs of trouble. "I pulled you over because your registration tags are expired. Can I see your license and registration?" The man nodded quickly, fumbling with his wallet. "Of course, officer," he said in a shaky voice, his hands trembling as he handed over the documents. Officer Parker took them, glancing over the information. As he scanned the license and registration, he noticed something odd. There was a child in the back seat of the car. The little girl, no older than 5 or 6, sat quietly in the car seat. She was facing forward, her small hands resting on the edge of the seat. Her presence didn't immediately stand out. It was normal to see children in cars after all. What struck the officer, though, was the stillness of the child. She wasn't playing with toys or looking out the window like children usually do. She sat with an unnerving calm, her body stiff and unmoving. Parker's focus shifted to her. There was something in the way she sat, an unnatural stillness that made the officer pause. Most children would be fidgeting or talking at least a little bit, but not this little girl. She was eerily quiet. Her large eyes stared straight ahead, and her tiny hands were clasped tightly on the edge of the seat. Officer Parker's instincts kicked in. Something wasn't right. His eyes flicked to the driver, who was still nervously trying to hand over his papers. "Everything all right in there?" the officer asked, trying to keep his voice calm. But inside, a small knot had started to form in his stomach. It was a gut feeling, one he couldn't quite explain, but it was there. The driver nodded quickly, but there was something about his expression now that caught the officer's attention. The man's face had gone pale, and his mouth was dry. He swallowed hard before responding. Yes, everything's fine, officer. Just a routine drive." But Officer Parker wasn't convinced. His gaze shifted back to the little girl, and something about her stare made his skin crawl. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had seen this child somewhere before, but he couldn't place where. It wasn't a thought he could easily dismiss. The officer took another moment to observe the situation. He knew he had to remain professional, but his mind raced. What was going on here? Why was the child so still? Why was the driver so nervous? The longer he stared at the girl, the more unsettled he felt. The streetlights above flickered, casting strange shadows over the car. The quietness of the night seemed to grow even deeper, more suffocating. Officer Parker couldn't put his finger on it, but something told him this was no ordinary traffic stop. There was more to this situation than met the eye. He took a deep breath, steadying himself, and made the decision to investigate further. It was just a feeling, a hunch he couldn't ignore. He had to find out who this little girl was, why she was so quiet, and what was really going on in the car. Something was off. and he was determined to get to the bottom of it. As Officer Parker stood there, his flashlight illuminating the inside of the car, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. His eyes kept drifting back to the little girl in the backseat. She hadn't moved a muscle, and her large eyes were still fixed ahead, staring straight into the front of the car. She seemed completely still, like a doll, too still for a child her age. Parker couldn't remember the last time he had seen a child behave this way, and it troubled him more than he wanted to admit. He glanced again at the driver, who was still nervously clutching the papers. There was something unsettling about the way he was holding them, as if he didn't want to let go. He wasn't even looking at the officer anymore. His eyes were glued to the rearview mirror, his gaze flicking between the rearview and the little girl in the back. It was clear the driver was avoiding any eye contact with the officer. His discomfort was almost palpable, and it made Parker's instincts flare even stronger. Why was this man so jumpy? "Is she all right?" Officer Parker asked, trying to keep his voice calm, but his question felt heavy in the air. He didn't know why he felt the need to ask, but something about the girl made him feel like he needed to be sure. "Your daughter? Is she feeling okay?" The man's hand shook as he reached for the steering wheel. He swallowed hard before turning his eyes back to the officer. "She's fine," he said quickly, his voice too sharp, too quick. "She's just tired. We've been on the road for a while." But his words seemed hollow, like he was trying to convince himself more than the officer. Parker wasn't convinced. His eyes were drawn to the girl again. She hadn't even blinked. In fact, her expression seemed almost blank. It didn't make sense. A child that young, especially one in a car for a long time, would normally be fidgeting, asking questions, or looking out the window. But this girl, she didn't do any of that. She just sat there, motionless. Her hair, which was neatly tucked behind her ears, swayed gently with the movements of the car, but her body didn't budge an inch. The officer took a step closer, his shoes making a soft scrape on the pavement. He shone his flashlight into the backseat, but his eyes weren't just looking at the girl. He was trying to get a better look at the entire situation. The backseat was relatively tidy, and there wasn't anything particularly alarming about it. There were no signs of distress, no broken windows, and no obvious signs that anything was wrong. But the silence, the silence, was almost too much to ignore. As the officer stood there, trying to make sense of it all, a chill ran down his spine. It wasn't just the girl's stillness that unnerved him. It was the strange feeling of familiarity. He kept thinking he had seen her before, but where? Her face was hauntingly familiar, but it was the eyes that stuck with him. They were wide and wide open, staring ahead with an intensity that sent a shiver through his bones. He had seen eyes like that before, on missing person posters. The thought hit him like a ton of bricks. Could it be? Could this be the same little girl from the case he had worked on years ago? The case that had haunted him for so long. His mind raced as he tried to piece it all together. The girl's face, her stillness, the unsettling vibe coming from the driver. It all seemed to connect in a way that made his heart pound in his chest. Was it really her? Could she have been missing all these years, and now here she was, sitting quietly in the back of a stranger's car? The officer's thoughts swirled, and he knew he couldn't ignore the growing suspicion in his gut. He had to find out more. He had to know who this little girl was, even if it meant digging deeper than a simple traffic stop. "Sir," Officer Parker said, his voice firmer now, though his heart was still racing. "I need to ask you a few more questions about your daughter. There's something strange going on here. I need to be sure she's okay." The driver's face went even paler at the officer's words. His eyes darted nervously from side to side, and he swallowed again, his throat dry. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "There's nothing wrong, officer," the man stammered. But his shaky voice only made Parker more suspicious. "We're just passing through. It's a long drive, and we've had a rough few days." Parker knew better than to trust the man's words right now. Something was off, and the officer wasn't going to let it go. He had a duty to protect people, and if something was wrong here, he needed to figure out what it was before it was too late. He couldn't ignore the growing sense that there was more to this situation than met the eye. The girl in the backseat had a story to tell, and Officer Parker was determined to find out what it was. The more Officer Parker observed the scene in front of him, the more unsettled he became. The little girl's gaze had not wavered. She still sat motionless in the backseat, her wide eyes fixed on nothing in particular. It was as if she was frozen in time, unaware of the world around her. The officer had encountered many situations over the years, but this was unlike anything he had ever experienced. His mind kept racing back to his earlier thought. Her face. There was something so familiar about her, something he couldn't shake. The more he thought about it, the clearer it became. The girl's wide eyes, her innocent face, even the way she sat so still, reminded him of a case he had worked on years ago, when he was still a young officer. It had been a missing persons case, one that had left him haunted for months after it was over. The little girl had vanished without a trace, and despite all the effort, the case went cold. The child had been missing for so long, no one expected to hear anything about her again. And yet here she was, sitting right in front of him. Could it really be her? Officer Parker felt a chill run down his spine. His heart pounded in his chest as he stared at the girl. Her features were so familiar, but could it really be the same child? He struggled to make sense of it. There had been no news, no updates about the case. How could she have just appeared out of nowhere? The driver, still avoiding the officer's gaze, shifted nervously in his seat. He kept glancing at the rearview mirror, his eyes flicking back to the girl every few seconds. He wasn't looking at Officer Parker anymore. His attention seemed completely focused on the child in the backseat, as if he was afraid of something. The officer caught a glimpse of the driver's face in the dim light of the squad car's headlights. The man's face was pale, beads of sweat starting to form on his forehead. His nervousness had grown even more obvious, and it only made Parker more suspicious. "Sir, I need to know where you're coming from," Officer Parker said, his voice calm but firm. "And who is she?" "This little girl. Where is she from?" The driver's eyes darted back to Parker, a flash of panic crossing his face. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came out at first. His hands gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles turning white. He finally managed to stutter. She's my daughter. We're just passing through. We've been on a long trip." But Officer Parker didn't buy it. There was too much uncertainty in the driver's voice. The man's story didn't add up. If she was his daughter, why wasn't she saying anything? Why was she so eerily still? Why was she staring at him like that, as if she knew something he didn't? The officer's suspicion grew stronger. The more he thought about the girl, the more he began to question her identity. Was she really the child of the man in the front seat, or was there something more going on here, something he was missing? He couldn't let it go. There was a reason why he couldn't take his eyes off the girl, why his instincts were screaming at him to dig deeper. This wasn't just a simple traffic stop. He needed to get to the bottom of this, even if it meant going beyond the usual procedure. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to step out of the vehicle," Officer Parker said. His voice was steady now, his authority unmistakable. "I need to make sure everything is okay." The driver hesitated. For a moment, it seemed like he might refuse. His eyes flickered to the rearview mirror again, and his hands trembled as he clutched the steering wheel. "I don't think that's necessary, officer," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "We're just tired. It's late. Please, let us go." But Officer Parker was determined. He could feel that something wasn't right, and he couldn't let the situation go without investigating further. He needed to know more about this little girl and the man who was hiding something. With a sigh, the officer took another step closer to the car, his hand hovering near his radio, ready to call for backup if necessary. "I'm not asking for your permission," he said firmly. "I'm telling you. Please step out of the vehicle." The driver's face twisted with worry. His eyes darted between the officer and the girl in the backseat. There was a moment of silence, thick with tension. Then, with a reluctant nod, the man slowly opened the door and stepped out of the car. As he did, the officer's eyes moved to the little girl once again. She had not moved an inch. Her eyes were still wide, still locked in place, as if waiting for something. Officer Parker stood by the car, his heart racing as the driver reluctantly stepped out. The man's body language was tense, his eyes still darting toward the little girl in the backseat. It was as though he was afraid of something beyond just a routine traffic stop. The officer couldn't shake the feeling that he was on the edge of something much bigger than he had expected. As the driver slowly moved to the front of the car, Officer Parker's mind kept going back to the girl in the backseat. Her unblinking stare seemed almost unnatural. She hadn't made a sound, hadn't shifted her position once since the stop had begun. For a moment, the officer thought he saw a flicker of recognition in her eyes, but he quickly brushed it off. It had to be his imagination. Taking a deep breath, Parker kept his voice calm but firm. "Sir, I need you to stay here while I speak with the girl in the back seat," he said, motioning for the driver to remain by the front of the car. He wasn't going to let this go. Something was off, and he needed to get to the bottom of it. He turned to approach the back of the car. As he walked around, he could feel the weight of the situation pressing on him. The street was still quiet, the only sound the occasional rustling of leaves in the breeze. The officer knew that what had started as a simple traffic stop had now become something much more significant. He couldn't explain why, but he felt as though he was on the brink of discovering something that would change everything. When he reached the back window, he crouched down to get a better look at the girl. She didn't react to his presence at all. She remained completely still, her eyes still wide and unblinking. The officer took a step closer and spoke softly, trying to keep the situation as calm as possible. "Hey there, sweetheart," he said gently, his voice soft. "Are you okay? Do you want to talk to me?" There was no response, just the same eerie stillness. The officer's heart sank as he wondered again if this was the same little girl from the missing persons case. The girl who had been gone for years, a case that had never been solved. The girl who had haunted his dreams and kept him up late at night, wondering what had happened to her. Is everything all right with her? Officer Parker called over his shoulder, directing the question to the driver, though he didn't expect a clear answer. The man had been quiet ever since stepping out of the car, but when he heard the question, he seemed to freeze. His body stiffened, and he swallowed hard, his eyes flicking nervously back to the car. She's just tired," the driver said quickly, his voice shaky. "She doesn't talk much, officer. It's just been a long drive. That's all." Parker didn't buy it. There was something off about the driver's response, his lack of conviction. The man was avoiding the officer's gaze again, and his hands were trembling. The officer could feel the tension in the air growing thicker, like something was about to break. The officer's gaze returned to the girl. She hadn't moved a muscle, but now there was something else in her eyes, a glimmer of something. For just a brief moment, Parker thought he saw a flicker of recognition in her gaze. She seemed to look directly at him, and for the first time since the stop began, she blinked. Her eyelids fluttered, and she let out a soft sigh, though it was barely audible. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make Parker's heart skip a beat. He leaned in closer, still trying to keep things calm. "Sweetheart, do you know where you are?" he asked gently, his voice low and reassuring. He was trying to get her to speak, to respond in some way that could help him understand what was happening here. The little girl didn't answer, but her eyes moved slightly, as if she was thinking. There was a flicker of awareness in her expression now, and it made Parker wonder, was she remembering something? Could she be trying to communicate with him, but just didn't know how? Or was she waiting for something, waiting for him to ask the right question? The officer took a deep breath. He needed to keep his emotions in check. He had to stay focused. As much as he wanted to dive straight into the mystery of the girl's identity, he couldn't rush it. The more he looked at her, the more he realized that every little detail could mean something important. "Where did you come from, sweetheart?" he asked softly, though he didn't expect an immediate answer. He knew she might not respond at all, but there was something in his gut telling him that the girl could hold the key to solving a case that had haunted him for years. The silence that followed was thick, almost suffocating. The girl blinked again, but this time her eyes seemed to shift slightly, like she was starting to comprehend what was being asked. It was a small sign, but for Officer Parker, it was enough to give him hope. There was something going on here. Officer Parker stood silently, trying to piece together what he had observed so far. The girl's quiet demeanor, the driver's nervousness, and the unsettling feeling that this was all far more complicated than it appeared. It was like everything in the world had slowed down for a moment, as if the pieces of a puzzle were slowly falling into place, but just out of reach. The girl's gaze, though still wide and unblinking, seemed to hold a story that Parker couldn't understand yet. He turned his focus back to the driver, who was still standing by the front of the car, his arms crossed over his chest. The man was visibly trembling now, though he was trying to mask it. His lips were pressed tightly together, as if he was holding something back. The officer could feel the tension in the air, thick and heavy, like a storm was about to break. Parker knew he had to stay calm, but his mind was racing. He had seen enough in his career to know that something was wrong here. The man's avoidance of the officer's questions, his strange behavior, and the girl's eerie stillness were all clues pointing in a direction he didn't yet fully understand. The officer took a slow, deliberate step toward the driver, maintaining a firm but calm stance. "I'm going to ask you one more time, sir. Where are you coming from? And who is this girl? I need to know the truth." The driver's eyes flickered, and for the first time, he seemed to hesitate. He looked down at his feet, avoiding the officer's gaze. Then, almost too quietly to hear, he mumbled, She's just my daughter. We're traveling across the state. That's all. Nothing to worry about." But Officer Parker wasn't buying it. His instincts screamed that something wasn't right. The man's voice lacked conviction, and the words seemed rehearsed. The officer had been trained to spot lies and evasions, and this man's behavior was giving him every reason to doubt his story. Parker's eyes flicked back to the little girl in the car. She was still sitting there, her hands clutching the seat in front of her, her eyes fixed ahead. He tried to gauge whether she was reacting to the conversation, or if she was aware of the situation, but she seemed oblivious to everything around her. It was as if she was in her own world, untouched by the chaos unfolding outside the car. The officer's mind began to work faster. Was it possible that this little girl was the same child from the missing persons case, the one who had disappeared years ago without a trace? He had seen the missing posters, the sad photos of the smiling child, but that was a long time ago. No one had heard anything about her since then, and the case had grown cold. Could it be that this was her? Was this the same girl who had haunted his thoughts for so long? The possibility made his stomach twist. He couldn't ignore the feeling that everything in his gut was telling him that something significant was happening here. "Sir, I'm going to need to take the girl out of the car," Officer Parker said firmly, trying to remain calm despite the whirlwind of thoughts in his mind. "I need to make sure she's all right." The driver immediately stiffened, his entire body locking up. His face went even paler, if that was possible, and his hands trembled. No, she's fine. Please, you don't need to do that," he pleaded, his voice breaking. "We're just passing through. It's late, and we've had a long day. She just wants to rest." Parker could tell that the driver was desperate, but it only confirmed his suspicions. Why was the man so afraid? What was he hiding? The officer couldn't back down now. He needed to be sure. "I'm not asking," Parker said, his voice unwavering. "I'm telling you, sir, I need to make sure she's okay." The man looked down at the ground, and for a moment, Parker thought he might not respond. Then, with a shaky breath, the driver stepped aside, letting the officer approach the car. As Parker opened the door to the backseat, he could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He knew that what came next could change everything. The girl still hadn't moved, hadn't made a sound. It was as if she was waiting for something. But what? Why wasn't she reacting to the officer's presence? Why hadn't she said anything? "Sweetheart," Parker said gently as he leaned into the car. "Can you tell me your name?" The girl's eyes flickered, just slightly, as if she had heard him, but she didn't speak. Parker repeated the question, this time a little more firmly, but there was no change. The officer glanced up at the driver, who was now standing a few feet away, nervously watching the scene unfold. His eyes were filled with something. Fear, guilt, confusion, maybe all of those things combined. Officer Parker stood in the quiet stillness of the night, his eyes locked on the little girl in the backseat of the car. It was as if everything else had faded into the background. The streetlights, the hum of his police radio, even the nervous breathing of the driver. All he could focus on was the girl's expressionless face. There was something haunting about her stillness, and the longer he looked at her, the more the feeling in his gut grew. Something wasn't right. The officer took a step closer, his voice soft but filled with authority. "Sweetheart, can you tell me your name?" He asked again, his words more of a request than a command. He was trying to coax her, trying to make her feel safe enough to speak. But the girl remained silent, her wide eyes staring ahead, unblinking. Parker couldn't help but notice how unnaturally calm she was. Most children in situations like this would be nervous, scared, or at least fidgeting. But she hadn't moved an inch. It was as if she was trapped in her own world, unable to react to what was happening around her. The officer's mind raced with possibilities. Was this girl the same one from the missing persons case? The one who had disappeared without a trace years ago? If so, why was she here, in the back of this man's car, without a word? The driver shifted nervously, his eyes darting between Parker and the girl. "She's just tired, officer," he said, his voice shaking. "Please, just let us go. We don't mean any harm." But Parker wasn't convinced. The man's words didn't match his body language. The way he kept avoiding the officer's gaze, the way his hands trembled, all of it pointed to something deeper, something he wasn't willing to admit. The officer had learned to trust his instincts, and right now, every bone in his body was telling him there was more to this than met the eye. The officer's gaze returned to the girl. She hadn't moved, but there was something in her eyes now, a subtle shift, as if she was beginning to register his presence. For the first time, her lips parted slightly, and she let out a soft, almost imperceptible sigh. It wasn't much, but to Parker, it felt like a breakthrough. "Sweetheart," he said again, this time more gently. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" There was a long pause before the girl finally did something. She turned her head slightly, just enough to make eye contact with the officer. Her eyes were wide, filled with a strange mix of confusion and recognition, as if she was processing something important. For a moment, Parker felt a rush of relief. Maybe, just maybe, she was starting to understand that he was there to help her. But then, just as quickly, her gaze flickered away, and she returned to her previous stillness. Parker felt his heart race again. The girl's behavior was strange, but there was something familiar about her, something he couldn't quite place. He had seen many children in distress before, but this felt different. It was as if this girl had been through something much more than a simple case of fear or exhaustion. He couldn't put his finger on it, but his gut told him that this was more than just an ordinary traffic stop. "Sir," Parker called out to the driver, his voice firm but calm, "I need you to tell me the truth. What's going on here? Why is she acting like this? Why won't she speak?" The driver's face went pale, his eyes wide with fear. He opened his mouth as if to speak but seemed to hesitate. His lips trembled, and it was clear that he was struggling to find the right words. For a moment, Parker thought the man might finally break and reveal something important. But instead, the driver swallowed hard and shook his head. "She's just tired," he repeated, his voice barely audible. "She's been through a lot. Please, officer, I'm begging you. Just let us go." Parker's mind spun. The more the driver spoke, the more convinced he became that this man was hiding something. There was no way a simple traffic stop could be causing him this much distress unless there was something else going on. Something bigger, something darker. "Step back from the car," Parker said, his voice taking on a more commanding tone. "I need to make sure everything is all right." The driver hesitated for a moment, his body stiff, his face a mask of worry. But after a tense pause, he finally took a few steps back, keeping his eyes fixed on the girl in the backseat. It was almost as if he didn't want to take his eyes off her. Parker watched the man closely, but his focus quickly returned to the girl. He was determined to figure out what was really going on. The officer opened the back door of the car gently, trying not to startle the girl. As he did, he could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on him. The words hung in the air, and for a moment, Officer Parker couldn't believe what he had just heard. The little girl's voice was so quiet, so fragile, but it cut through the tension in the air like a knife. "Help me." The words echoed in his mind over and over again, as his heart raced in his chest. He crouched lower, now fully focused on the girl in the backseat. She hadn't spoken since the moment the officer had arrived, but now, for the first time, she was showing signs of life. It wasn't much, but it was enough to send a chill down Parker's spine. There was something about her, something deeply unsettling about the way she spoke. Her eyes, wide and vacant just moments ago, were now filled with a quiet desperation. "Sweetheart, I'm here to help you," Parker said softly, trying to keep his voice gentle, even though his mind was in turmoil. He couldn't explain it, but something in the girl's voice made him feel like she had been through more than just a simple ordeal. There was a history in those words, a sense of fear and helplessness that seemed far beyond what any child should experience. The driver, still standing a few feet away, shifted nervously. His hands were shaking, and his eyes darted between the officer and the girl in the backseat. It was clear that he was afraid of something, but Parker wasn't sure if it was fear for the girl or fear of being caught in something far more sinister. The officer glanced over his shoulder at the man, but his focus quickly returned to the girl. "Sweetheart, can you tell me what's going on? Are you in danger?" Parker asked, his voice soft but insistent. He needed to understand. He had to know what had happened to her, and why she seemed so terrified of speaking up. The girl's lips quivered, as if she was about to say something more. But then, just as quickly, her eyes darted away. She seemed to shrink into herself, as though afraid of something. Parker watched her closely, trying to gauge her emotions, but it was almost impossible to read her. Her expression was so empty, so devoid of anything other than fear. The officer felt his frustration grow. He couldn't stand seeing a child in this kind of distress, and the uncertainty of the situation was starting to gnaw at him. Without thinking, Parker reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, quickly sending a message to his partner, Detective Ramirez. He needed backup. He couldn't handle this on his own anymore. The tension in the air was palpable, and he had a feeling that this case was far more complex than he could solve with just his own instincts. Turning his attention back to the girl, Parker spoke again. "Listen, I'm not going to hurt you. I just want to make sure you're safe. Can you tell me where you came from? Who brought you here?" For a long time, there was only silence. The girl's eyes stayed fixed on the officer, but she didn't speak. It was like she was frozen in place, unable or unwilling to say anything. Parker could feel the frustration building in his chest, but he knew he had to remain patient. He couldn't push her too hard. She needed to feel safe, not trapped. Then, as if by some miracle, the girl finally moved. She shifted slightly in her seat, drawing Parker's attention. Her eyes flickered toward the driver, who was still standing far away, his posture stiff. The officer followed her gaze, noting the way the man was watching the girl, his expression unreadable. It was clear that there was some kind of connection between them, but what kind of relationship it was, Parker wasn't sure. "Is that your dad?" Parker asked, trying to sound casual. He knew it was a risk to ask, but he needed to gauge the girl's reaction. Maybe, just maybe, it would give him more insight into what was really going on. Officer Parker's mind was racing as the girl's whispered plea echoed in his ears. "Please help me." Those words were like a heavy weight pressing down on his chest, urging him to act quickly. He had been trained for moments like this, moments where instinct and reason had to come together, but nothing had prepared him for the feeling of helplessness that washed over him as he stared into the girl's eyes. There was something so haunting about her, something that told him she had been through more than anyone should ever experience. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. He couldn't let fear or uncertainty cloud his judgment. His job was to protect, to serve, and right now, this little girl needed him. "It's okay," he said, his voice as calm as he could make it, though his heart was pounding. "I'm here to help. I need you to trust me." For a long moment, the girl didn't respond. Her eyes were still locked on his, but she remained as still as a statue. Parker could feel the tension hanging thick in the air. He knew he needed to get through to her, to help her open up. But how? What could he say to make her feel safe enough to speak? Then, just as he was about to try again, something changed in the girl's expression. It was subtle, but he saw it. Her eyes flickered to the side, towards the driver, and then back to him. For the first time, she seemed to be processing something. Her lips parted slightly, as though she was about to speak, but no words came out. It was like she was fighting an internal battle, torn between wanting to say something and being too afraid to. Parker waited, giving her the time she needed. He knew this wasn't something that could be rushed. She needed to feel comfortable, to feel that she wasn't in any danger. But time was slipping away. The longer she stayed silent, the more he wondered if something was about to happen, something that would change everything. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the girl took a deep breath and spoke, her voice shaky but filled with emotion. "He's not my dad." The words came out in a whisper, but to Parker, it was like a bombshell. Everything about the situation had just shifted in an instant. The girl wasn't the daughter of the man in the front seat. What did that mean? Parker's mind scrambled to make sense of the revelation. He couldn't let the shock show on his face, but internally his thoughts were racing. If this man wasn't her father, then who was he? What was his connection to the girl, and why had he been lying about it? The officer needed answers, and he needed them fast. "Who is he, then?" Parker asked gently, keeping his voice soft and non-threatening. He didn't want to scare the girl. She had already shown so much fear. "Why are you with him?" The girl hesitated, and Parker could see her struggling to find the right words. She bit her lip nervously, her eyes welling up with tears. For a moment, Parker thought she might close up again, but then she spoke, her voice barely more than a whisper. He took me," she said, her words faltering with each breath. "He said he was going to take me to a safe place. But it's not safe. It's not." Parker's heart sank as the weight of the girl's words hit him like a punch to the gut. He had been right all along. This wasn't just a simple traffic stop. This was something much darker. He had a million questions running through his mind, but at that moment, there was only one thing that mattered: getting this girl to safety. "Why didn't you say anything before?" Parker asked, his voice soft but full of concern. He could tell she was terrified, but he needed to understand. "Why didn't you ask for help?" The girl's gaze dropped to the floor, and she seemed to shrink in on herself. I was scared," she whispered. "I didn't know who to trust." Parker nodded, understanding more than he could say. This little girl had been through so much, and the trust she was placing in him meant everything. He couldn't let her down. He reached out, gently placing a hand on her shoulder, trying to reassure her that she was safe now. "You're safe now," he said firmly, his voice full of conviction. I promise you, no one is going to hurt you anymore." Just as he was about to speak again, he heard the sound of footsteps approaching. He turned his head, and to his relief, Detective Ramirez appeared, stepping quickly toward the car. Ramirez had been the one he'd called for backup earlier, and seeing his partner now gave him a sense of reassurance. They were going to figure this out together. Ramirez took one look at the scene and immediately understood what had happened. Without a word, he stepped forward, ready to take control of the situation. "Parker, what do we have here?" he asked, his eyes flicking between the girl and the driver.